Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak at the symposium. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I've put together a talk that I hope will be of interest about some new pathways in conservation biology. And what I'm going to do is touch on these 5 items quite quickly. The first one just is a bit of a review of how nature conservation has been framed. And this is a bit of a personal perspective of my own history in being a conservation biologist and how those framings have changed over about the last 30 years or so. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the intergovernmental agreements, IPBES and the SDGs, and how they think about nature conservation, how we might incorporate it better in order to bring biodiversity conservation into these wider policy agendas. And then I'll touch on how biodiversity fits in to the framing of nature and its relationship to ecosystem services. I'll talk a little bit about resilience of ecosystem functions and then show you some work we've done recently about the costs and benefits of investing in natural systems. So just to start with this framing of nature conservation, we all know that if we look forward with growing human populations and growing consumption and increasing pressures from climate change and land use change and so on, wild species and natural habitats are going to become increasingly dominated by people and their needs. And so there's going to have to be some prioritization. We're going to have to do some kinds of conservation and not others. And that begs the question of what it is that conservation is for. What do people think is the goal of conservation? And I've always really liked Bill Adams's book called Against Extinction, which makes the point that the one thing that unites conservation biologists is that they are against extinction. The one thing we all agree we don't want to see happening is species going extinct. But exactly what we're for, what the objectives of conservation are, is something that is less clear and has actually changed over time. And these 4 framings that I've talked about before that date from 1960s to the present day just help to show the breadth of attitudes to conservation. So the first one of these that I call nature for itself is the kind of origins of nature conservation. We're saving nature because we like it for its own systems. We like species, we like beautiful places, remote places and wilderness areas. And this framing is very much about protected areas and preserving species in their own right. And the science of it is the science that I learned as an undergraduate, actually, about protected areas, whether you have one large one or several small ones, whether they're fenced or unfenced and so on. It's a very pure nature conservation framing. And we did that for a number of years, but it became clear that on its own, setting aside areas for protection and wilderness areas were not going to be enough. And we move into the second frame that I call nature despite people. So this is focusing on the threats to species, habitat loss, pathogens, pollution, overexploitation, all the usual drivers of change, and is geared around trying to hold back those pressures on species, trying to stop the pressures wherever they are, not just in protected areas and so on. But trying to deal directly with threats. And that was a very popular way to do science in the 1980s, 1990s. But by around the year 2000, it became clear that wasn't enough either. Simply setting aside protected areas or trying to deal with the threats was not holding back the loss of wild nature, was not stopping species slipping towards extinction. And we moved into this third framing, which I call nature for people, which turns the whole argument around and now starts to say, what is it that nature does for people? much more self-serving framing. Not what do we do for wild species, but what does nature do for us? And this is the ecosystem services framing. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was a major step in getting this widespread. So now we have landscapes and systems that do have people in. In fact, many of them are human-dominated systems where you can see ecosystem services being played out, water regulation, and you start hearing people talking about the value of nature, the economic values. There's a lot of emphasis on water and various kinds of non-biological ecosystem functions, flood regulation, and natural nature-based solutions to environmental hazards and so on. And of course, things like pollinators become very important as ecosystem services. So it's a very different way of looking at conservation. Many conservationists adopted it, but then became slightly uncomfortable with the very utilitarian perspective. It's very much a self-serving view of nature. And of course, it's still a very common way to think about nature conservation, but I think it's changed into a slightly different perspective, the fourth one that I call people and nature. And this is a framing that is a bit more about the dynamic relationships between people and nature. It's not just what does nature do for people, it recognizes that people and actually all human societies have developed and evolved alongside nature and natural systems. We are interdependent with nature. And so it's not just what nature does for people, it's how people support nature to do the things that we need from it. So we have human-dominated landscapes, but they tend to look a bit more attractive than some of the more utilitarian ones. And we can see people investing in activities that help nature to deliver services, things like helping coastal dune systems to grow and develop resistance to coastal flooding, new ways of doing crop development that enhance pollinators and enhance the wildlife in the margins of crop areas and so on. And the other thing about people and nature is that this framing is a bit more forward-looking. It very much focuses on the resilience and adaptability of natural systems. It recognizes that we're going to go on living in a changing world. And one of the things that we can do to help people cope with future changes is to use nature's own coping mechanisms. We know that the reason we live in a diverse world where there's a variety of life on Earth is because biological systems have their own adaptive processes. They've been very good at coping with and adapting to change over millions of years. And we rely on that interdependence for our own future. So those four framings, which I summarize, showing them moving from one to the other, starting in sort of 1960s, 1970s, coming up to the present day. And although I've suggested they replace one another, in fact they don't. When you get to the present day, all four of those are still in place. There are still people who work centrally within any one of them. There are a large number of people who feel very strongly that they should be working in the nature for itself framing. There are still plenty of people dealing with threats and trying to hold back the pressures. There's a large number of people dealing directly with ecosystem services. And then there's this fourth one that I personally find more interesting and that I think can actually embrace the other three, and that is more forward-looking, where we're starting to try and develop new ways of thinking, and that I'll focus on for the rest of this talk. The other thing to point out in this summary slide is that as we moved from nature for itself, which was really the domain of ecologists and wildlife biologists, it was very firmly centered on natural science. As we move from that through the ecosystem services and into people and nature, the required skills become much broader. We start having to include economics, other kinds of environmental science, and then certainly in people in nature, it's a very interdisciplinary area of working. Social science, economics, being able to work with political scientists and think about social change, transformation, and a whole load of things that are not necessarily the domain of conservation biologists. But generally, the interesting shift, I think, is that we've moved from preserving these components of nature and the existing patterns of nature to more thinking about future form and function, thinking about adaptability and resilience. And although it looks like nature for itself was actually about nature and people and nature is more about people, I think, in fact, the whole thing is about people's dependence on nature and just various ways of framing it. Now, the fact that all four of these are in place at the moment is one of the things that makes this discussion about how do we measure conservation success quite difficult. If you think about nature for itself, it's very clear what the measures of success would be there. They're simple measures to do with whether we've got viable populations of rare species, whether there are wilderness areas that are still functioning in the way that they did decades ago, whether protected areas are protecting the species that they were set up for, and so on. So the measures of success are biological, and they're things that ecologists and conservation biologists are pretty good at measuring. When you get into things like nature for people and nature, the measures of success are much more difficult because they're far more around either the benefits that people receive from ecosystems or, more complicated still, the adaptability and resilience of this linked human-nature relationship. And I think that's why it's becoming quite difficult to measure success across these different framings and to prioritize actions. We're not always talking the same language. And as we get to these more complex and nuanced framings that have more recently emerged, it's not quite clear that we actually have the right metrics anyway. There's a third area of complication on this slide, valuing nature, what is being valued and by whom, which is about the economic valuation of nature. And I'm not going to talk about that because it's a very big subject, but just to point out that this is one of the activities that very strongly divides people across these different framings. People who are strong advocates of nature for itself are very uncomfortable with economic valuation. They feel that nature is of infinite value itself, and the minute you put a monetary value on it, it demeans it, and it kind of looks as though you're only interested in it because of what you can earn from it. Whereas in nature for people, especially, and some of the people and nature work, economic valuation is kind of implicit to that whole way of working. So that's a difficult area that I'm not going to deal with, except I'll touch on it at the very end. So just to move on to thinking about these large policy initiatives, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it's interesting to just look at how these represent nature, because these are both initiatives that span this human-nature relationship. So IPBES, which many people will probably be familiar with, is a platform that was created by the United Nations in 2012, was set up to be an IPCC-type body for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And IPBES has a conceptual framework that looks rather complicated, but that tries to characterize this set of links between nature's benefits for people, and a good quality of life. And it's an interesting framework in that it's geared around good quality of life. The top level frame in the frame, the box at the top, which is about good quality of life or human well-being, living in harmony with nature, is what the nature and nature's benefits to people are geared to. And whether or not that good quality of life from nature is achieved is influenced by a set of boxes in the middle, these anthropogenic assets, all the other things that people have and do, and then things to do with institutions, governance, and the direct drivers of change, land use, habitat conversion, exploitation, climate change, and so on. So the idea is to show that it's through human activities, and particularly the way that people influence nature, that determines the flow of nature's benefits to people, maybe ecosystem services, and then that in turn influences the good quality of life. And that's a circular relationship. So it deals with that dynamic relationship between people and nature. Now, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, these actually incorporate many of the things that are in IPBES, but is a much broader framing of sustainable development through to 2030. This has now been agreed to by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. So these 17 goals and about 170 or so detailed targets. The targets are really confusing, and I think it's much easier to think about the goals because some of the targets seem to be very contradictory to each other. It's worth looking at some of the background to the Sustainable Development Goals because that gives you a clue as to what's really different about these to earlier intergovernmental agreements. So one is this whole philosophy of leave no one behind. The SDGs apply to everybody. So unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were geared at the most extremely poor or poor health people on the earth, the Sustainable Development Goals apply to everyone. So they are to be enacted everywhere. And the second thing that's really interesting is that the Sustainable Developments put sustainable development at the core. And unlike earlier framings where there were separate pillars for social, economic and environmental dimensions of sustainability, the SDGs make clear that the three have to be integrated. So in the earlier framings, there was this three-legged stool that you had to achieve each of social, economic and environmental. And now it's recognised that those are actually to be integrated, and you have to do all of them to get sustainable development. And you have to think about them all as a system. So the SDGs are universal. They apply to everyone, every nation, every sector, cities, businesses, schools. Everyone's encouraged to deal with them. They're integrated, and achieving them will be transformative. It requires a very big fundamental change to how we live on Earth. And I think it's an opportunity for us to bring the environment and biodiversity conservation and good environmental management properly into sustainable development. So if you look at the goals, there are 17 of them, and a lot of them cover the usual ground of sustainable development: eradicating poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, education, gender equality, etc. There are three, numbers 13, 14 and 15, that are environmental goals: action on climate, life below water, and life on land. And you can regard those as goals by themselves, but thinking about this as a more integrated system gives us a way to think about, well, how do those other societal outcomes? So it's interesting to think about how we can make the link from these environmental sustainable development goals into the more social and economic ones. And I'm just going to show a framing that was written about by Jeff Wagi and colleagues in a paper in Lancet Global Health in 2015. And what they do is pull the goals into three different categories. The first one is a set of well-being goals. So these are the traditional well-being measures to do with poverty, eradicating poverty, creating good health, quality education, justice, reducing inequality, and so on. This is the normal business of national governments, and on the whole, achieving those things, it tends to be mutually supportive. If you have better education, you have better equality, you have better peace and justice, you have better health, less poverty, and so on. And those are underpinned by a set of what are called infrastructure goals, which are the things to do with food, water, energy, consumption and production, cities, and so on. These are a set of goals that very often are in conflict with each other. There's conflict over what to do with the land, whether to build cities or food systems, whether cities pollute the water that people need, and so on. So there's a lot of complicated issues to deal with in these infrastructure goals. And very often they're in the hands of the private sector. They're not the normal responsibility of national public bodies. And then there are the environmental goals, the climate, life on land, and life below water. And these underpin all these other goals. They underpin the production of food and water. They underpin the delivery of energy, and ultimately these good health and well-being outcomes. And the unfortunate thing is that nobody really manages these global environmental goals. We have the international conventions, but they're quite weak in terms of governance systems, and they rely on these international agreements, such as IPBES or the Climate Convention and so on. And very often they're pulled in different directions by demands for food and water. And actually biodiversity conservation on its own is a very weak player in that whole system. So what we need to do is to make the case that the natural environment is not only important because it underpins these other important outcomes, food, water, energy, and so on, but the natural environment is important because people value it in itself. And that's what comes into this more general idea of natural capital that I've been working on recently, looking at how natural capital assets, the various components of nature, underpin the benefits that people need and want from the natural world or from ecosystems. And the link between those two is what people tend to think of as ecosystem services. But I think it's interesting instead to think about what do we do to secure those assets, to secure the underpinning species, communities, landscapes, ecosystems, soil, air and water, for all the things that people need from them, food, energy, clean water, clean air, etc. So that's the kind of natural capital framing. And the thing that it does is it starts at the right-hand end of this slide. It says, let's think about the benefits that we need and make sure that we're investing in the environment, investing in nature, so that those are secured for the future. Now, that begs a very interesting question about where biodiversity, as we think about it traditionally, where that fits within that framing. And if you go back and look at the three boxes of assets, services, and benefits, actually biodiversity is in all of them. There's biodiversity in the underpinning assets. It's the species and the ecosystems that are just part of nature. These could be soil communities, they could be the wildlife, they could be plants that produce food and that secure energy and so on. There's also biodiversity that's a benefit, wildlife conservation. People like and value and really care for wild species, so it's a benefit on its own. And then some species actually are service deliverers themselves, and pollinators are the most obvious example. So I don't think we need to worry about biodiversity slipping out of this framing. Actually, it's all over it, and it's just being sure about what sits where. and how to make sure that it's secured in the right way. So this was some work we did for the UK National Ecosystem Assessment of the different roles of biodiversity. So biodiversity might be a regulator of ecosystem processes. It might be a deliverer of ecosystem services, pollinators, or the diversity of crop plants. And it might be a benefit in its own right. People like certain species and want to conserve them. The important thing here is that these are different sorts of species. The underpinning ones, the regulators, tend to be microorganisms or primary producers, plants, and so on. The benefits in themselves tend to be the charismatic larger vertebrates, birds, mammals, large flowering plants, and those kinds of things. And the ones that deliver ecosystem services might be the pollinators or might be crop and livestock relatives. Now, we worry about biodiversity because there's lots of evidence at all scales that biodiversity is declining. These are 3 different measures of biodiversity loss, all of which have been published recently. The PREDICT model, which is about the loss of local species richness. So this is the kind of hockey stick curve for biodiversity loss, showing very steep decline in local species richness since the late 19th century. The Living Planet Index, which is about loss of abundance. So you can see we've lost almost half of all vertebrate abundance globally in the last 40 years or so. And then the Red List Index, which is a measure of how fast species are moving towards extinction. So those are 3 different measures of biodiversity loss, but they're all declining, and they're all declining rather rapidly. And that's a concern if biodiversity underpins these benefits that people require from nature. And one of the reasons we worry about biodiversity loss is because of the wide evidence from experiments and from field trials that more diverse systems are more productive, are more efficient than less diverse systems. So this graph just shows you the average across many different experimental systems. As you increase the amount of diversity, you get better ecosystem functions. And it asymptotes, it stabilizes after a while, but it's an almost universal property of ecosystem functions that they're better with more diversity. Now, of course, one interesting thing is that that's highly variable. The shape of that relationship varies. And the most productive monoculture is better than the most diverse system. And that, of course, is the basis of agriculture. But many of these studies, as they've started to look over longer periods of time, to look at resilience and adaptability, it turns out diversity becomes more important as you go to bigger scales and as you go over longer time periods. So those biodiversity ecosystem function relationships are mostly well evidenced at small scales. They come from field experiments or laboratory experiments, and they very rarely last for longer than a few years. But it's one of the reasons we worry about biodiversity loss. At the other end of the scale, the very strong evidence for people driving biodiversity decline, those curves that I just showed you for the extinction risk, abundance, and local species richness, are largely global scale measures. They come across from large scale metrics of people's influence on biodiversity. So it's quite difficult to match up the local ecosystem function with the global biodiversity loss. And there is this gap in the middle at the scale at which policies are implemented and at which management is often undertaken. The landscape scale, on a temporal scale of decades, is where we don't have a lot of evidence at the moment, and we're quite bad at being able to provide strong evidence of the biodiversity role for ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services at those intermediate scales. And I think that's something that we're going to have to work a bit harder on in the years to come to link these cross-scale effects of biodiversity loss. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that becomes clear with biodiversity is for its importance in resilience. Those simple biodiversity ecosystem function relationships become much more prominent when you start to perturb the system. And so thinking about resilience is another way of really understanding what the role of biodiversity will be as we depend on wild nature, and wild nature depends on people's management. So this is a paper that came out a couple of years ago looking at the resilience of ecosystem functions. And the definition of resilience here is in two different forms. So resilience can be either resistance, that is the extent to which some system is able to buffer the effects of perturbations. So the first graph here is a system that's just varying over time, and there are different perturbations of different strengths. And a resistant system is one that maintains its function even in the face of quite big perturbations. A different kind of resilience is about how quickly the system recovers from perturbations. So the second graph shows a system that's that's not so good at resistance, but is good at recovery. It fails, but then it recovers very quickly. And resilience is really just how well the system as a whole continues to function in the face of environmental perturbations. These could be things like climate change, or novel pests and pathogens, or changing habitat types and so on. And actually, ecology tells us a whole series of important ways that nature can be enhanced to be more resilient. And the table here shows you those management interventions at the scale of species, communities, or at landscape. So if we're looking for species being resilient to environmental perturbations, then you can bring in management interventions that will help with resistance or recovery. And they have things to do with how sensitive the species is, its intrinsic rate of growth, whether or not it's got adaptive phenotypic plasticity, how genetically variable it is, and whether there's evidence of allele effects or other kinds of density-dependent effects. So that's very standard ecology. Population biology can contribute to a really improved understanding of the resilience of species. At the community level, there's a lot of interesting work emerging from studies of networks, of interaction networks in nature, looking at how the connections between species and how whether they have correlated traits, whether they're functionally redundant, what the structure of the network is, whether it's highly connected or not very well connected, how modular it is, whether there are subsystems within the system. All of those contribute to the resilience of the ecological community. And then at the landscape scale, there's lots of evidence about environmental heterogeneity, the connectivity of different ecosystems, the potential for different stable states, and the whole area of natural habitat cover at the landscape scale. So although this concept of resilience seems very complex and at the same time is very important, just looking through standard ecological studies, there's a lot we can contribute to that already. Now, what that tends to emphasize is that instead of thinking about one kind of benefit at a time, just thinking about food, or thinking about, renewable energy systems, or thinking about natural hazard regulation, many landscapes will actually be designed to deliver multiple benefits. So you might be wanting to do food production and wildlife conservation and natural hazard protection in the same landscape. And that may be a way in which the added value of natural systems management can really be demonstrated over other kinds of interventions. It's the ability of these complex natural landscapes to do many things at once that make them unique compared to some highly intensive landscapes. And so what I wanted to finish with was the example from some work we've been doing in the UK, working with the government and looking at the economics of investing in nature. So the question here is, if we're thinking about the landscape scale, so thinking about large-scale interventions, and assuming that there was a pot of money available from either private or public sector donors that was going to allow us to recreate ecosystems, restore or recover them, then what can we point to? What kinds of ecosystem recreation, restoration, and recovery would be a good prospect in terms of multiple ecosystem benefits? So this would be the timber food, water quality, soil quality, carbon sequestration, as well as species conservation. And we worked with some economists and some landscape ecologists to try and answer that question. And we came up with at least these 5 cases where there was really good evidence that investing in these natural systems would show a good return on expenditure. So these are things like an additional 250,000 hectares of woodlands, which generate lots of benefits in terms of recreation, wildlife, carbon sequestration, water regulation. The value actually was very high, £500 million a year, particularly if they were placed near towns where people benefit from them. We could also show really good return on investment in upland peatland restoration because of the carbon values, but also we know that there would be additional benefits for water quality, recreation and wildlife conservation. Wetland creation, mainly because of its contribution to flood regulation, and natural flood regulation is a very cost-effective way of protecting infrastructure. And the same of intertidal habitats. So this was also important for flood protection, but also carbon storage, wildlife conservation, and for commercial fish stocks. And then a 5th one, which is definitely a good return on investment, which is difficult to do, was improving fisheries management. So those 5, there was really strong evidence. There were another 4 where the evidence was good, but it just wasn't, there wasn't enough of it to really make a case to government. But these are also important ways of investing in natural systems from which people will benefit. So urban green space areas have huge recreational values for health benefits. Physical and mental health turn out to be very large. And of course, that's wildlife conservation as well. Improvements in air quality, improvements in the environmental performance of farming, and management at the catchment scale. All of those looked like good investments, but we couldn't actually get the monetary values on them. And what we did then was to compare the costs and benefits of investing in these natural systems with this kind of cost-benefit analysis that government does for built infrastructure. So things like road schemes, rail schemes, flood defences, housing, etc. And this graph just shows you the benefit to cost ratio for these built infrastructures versus the natural systems that I just talked about. And obviously it's quite a difficult calculation to make. Governments do this all the time, actually, deciding whether they're going to build rail networks or road networks. But the important thing here is that these investments in natural systems really stack up pretty well compared to the built system. So the woodland planting one in particular is at least as good, it's better than road and rail networks in terms of what it delivers for people. And even the catchment restoration and inland wetland restoration stack up pretty well compared to built infrastructure. So we made a recommendation to the Government Infrastructure Commission that they should include these natural investments in their infrastructure investment register, which they didn't do because they just didn't think it was infrastructure. But I still think it's a really important point that these do deliver many benefits for people that compare very well to other kinds of maintenance and recovery projects that governments undertake. So investing in natural assets can make economic sense if you really care about that, and some people do. So I was going to finish with that and just draw some conclusions. So I think it is important to acknowledge these multiple framings for nature conservation. It's not to say that any one is the right one, but they do create some misunderstandings about what the priorities are. And I would like people to think about the people and nature one, which I think can include many of the others within its umbrella. And that means you have to think about the needs and demands from the society, not just the potential supply. So this becomes the domain of social science, economics, political science, and not just of ecologists. And it means we need to work more closely with them. Having said that, I think we should be bolder about species and habitat restoration and conservation being an end in itself. It's not there just to support ecosystem services. These are things that everybody values. They're irreplaceable. If we lose species and habitats, we can't regain them. And so they should be up there with all these more utilitarian demands from the environment. And in fact, species and habitat restoration and conservation does underpin many of those ecosystem functions and services, as well as this future resilience and adaptability, which is going to become increasingly important. And there are some key research gaps around this scaling up from small studies and thinking about that resilience and adaptability. And that becomes particularly important when thinking about multiple benefits from the same ecosystem. And the example I talked about at the end is about investing in the stocks. And I think this may be a better approach to think about investing in that system, investing in the ecosystem, the whole interacting natural system, rather than focusing on ecosystem services one at a time. And my final conclusion is that we really should be very careful about losing nature without thinking about it, which is what we appear to be doing at the moment, partly because it delivers all these benefits, and partly because once we've lost it, it's very hard to restore. And with that, I'll finish with this really nice quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who said all this over 100 years ago. And this quote, this is actually an inscription on the wall of the Natural History Museum in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where he says, it's about nature. There is a delight in the hardy life of the open. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm. It's all really nice about the intrinsic value of nature. And then he says, the nation behaves well if it treats natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. I think that's a great quote, and I'll finish there. Thank you very much.